Good afternoon. This is our presentation on grading practices. So before we get into current grading practices, let's talk about the history of them and where they came from.
So the modern education system originated in the early 20th century with five major events. First was the rise in manufacturing, where the economy became industry focused and there was a large need for more factory workers. In addition, there were progressive reforms by figures such as John Dewey, who saw universal education as a key factor of fair democracy. In addition, migration and immigration were booming as urban populations exploded from European immigrants as well as migrants from rural areas. In addition, there was intelligence testing that became commonly used, which was initially used in the military, and therefore people were now judged by innate, unchangeable intelligence. Lastly, behaviorism grew um, from B.F. Skinner, where operant conditioning was used on students in order for them to be obedient for factories. And so the need for efficiency from all of these required um, a standardized system, which we now know as the A through F grading system that is used today.
Okay, so next we are looking at a crisis in education, grade inflation. So in 2016, nearly 67% of the US high school graduated with A minus average. However, while GPA are reaching record highs, SAT and scores have dropped to 30 years lows. So this creates an illusion of excellence. When almost half the students gets an A, the grade stops being a mark of mastery and starts being a participation. And and so why the grades are so high? Well, uh, first teachers feel their students like Iron Man juggling sports, clubs, and 12-hour a day is simply easier to give an A. And second, like while college are dropping the standardized tests and AI writing essays, the GPA is often the only metric left. So this leads to the narcissism of the like minor difference. While everyone has an A, a single A minus becomes a failure. Teachers have become the climate denier, pretending everything is fine, while this value of degree slowly erodes. And then how can we fix this? So solution is simple: bring back the B plus. An A minus often puts a student's potential to an early and convenient death. It tells them they're finished. And B plus, however, is a like offer a space for resilience, revision, and real feedback. We need to stop treating grades as commodities and start treating them as like real lessons in grit. It's a time for high school and colleges to have a real conversation, and the teachers need to finally tighten the belt.
So the problem with grading, many students and teachers alike feel that the disproportionate grading systems among school systems themselves is the problem. Students can have eight different classes amongst all different subjects, and each teacher will have their own grading system, whether that's exams, homework, and quizzes having their own different weights, or just generalized ISDs having their school systems set on a different grading system from colleges. So that leads the question, what is a grade? Well, by that means a grade of an A can show mastery, but a grade of an A can also show completion. Having A being the standard for mastery leads students down a path to only chase the grade and not the knowledge. And with that, there's also a lack of consistency because students instead chase the grade instead of the knowledge, and it creates a fundamental and foundational barrier as they increase and go on to higher education. Um, Another problem with the grading system is student confidence. Many current grading systems are confusing to most students, and they feel that they have to appeal to each grading system themselves, which, when you have eight different classes and eight different teachers, it also feels to students that they have to learn each teacher's grading style and expectations, which is almost unfair if they have to learn eight different subjects with that as well. So instead of making the system feel like a chore, there should be a change. And one of the changes is giving retakes, because giving retakes means that students can use exams as learning tools instead of as tests of knowledge. They can use their first exam to see what they really know. And if they know that they have a retake, they're able to use that exam and build off of it for a comprehensive final, or just as they move along in the subject. This also allows facilitators and teachers to correct learning before moving units, which eliminates the foundational barriers of students chasing after a current grade. But also, so students don't entirely blow off exams, teachers and facilitators should penalize the correction process slightly. Some teachers utilize parent signatures and parent approval for a student to have a retake. That way, students are being held accountable for their actions. And many teachers say, well, why should we offer students retakes? Because it's unfair. Other students should be praised for doing well on exams the first time. But overall, this system seems to have a fairly successful rate, especially when it comes to a timeline, because students are learning the material more fundamentally and they can move through their lessons further down the line much quicker.
So that brings us into how we will be able to redefine grades as feedback instead of the processes that we had mentioned before. So in summary, we had discussed how through conducting extensive research on the goals of the grading system, the structure of the gradebook, unit standards, and overall valuing learning as a process, the educators in this particular study, which if was not mentioned, was conducted by authors such as Donna T. in the previous slide. These educators were able to implement an equitable grading system, which ultimately gave students the agency and a thorough understanding of not only the progression of their learning, but the process of their learning as well. And in short, the results showed that there was a great improvement in students' behaviors and attitudes in their work and grades. This ultimately was accomplished through prioritizing explanation over a correct answer because it more closely displays understanding than simply being correct. Using categories rather than letter grades, such as meeting, approaching, developing, or beginning, which ultimately more accurately reflects where the student is at in learning. We also looked at how giving students examples of other students' work at different levels to get a clear understanding of the grading rubric would be beneficial. And then also how instead of grading missing assignments, such as deliberately putting them in as a zero with the intention of incentivizing students to do their works, um, focusing on more of urging students to come in to complete them. And a quote that we pulled from this particular study, which we thought well reflected the gist of what we want to accomplish in the redefinition of grading practices, was that we redefine grading practices to be more equitable, and it teaches students to value the learning process. Grading on understanding and mastery shows students their potential.
Building upon that, also within the same reading, the authors discuss what steps should be taken to create reform. And they actually implemented this within their classrooms using these steps. First, they outlined the goals of a successful grading system in order to figure out what exactly are they grading and creating cohesion within their grading systems. And the next step was to implement tier-based rubric systems in order to reflect mastery instead of completion. And in addition to that, their gradebook, such as within a system such as Canvas, reflected student mastery of standards by defining each of the skills that students should learn and making sure to keep track of each of those assignments that they complete. The next step is valuing learning as a process. As we mentioned earlier, the educators valued learning and students' ability to explain over their ability to complete the work. And in doing so, instead of averaging scores over time throughout the year, if students had lower scores in the beginning of the school year, it was replaced with current better scores that better reflected their mastery. And the last step is observations and reflections. In order to make sure that the system is properly working throughout the year, students were actively involved in scoring activities and within scoring their own work to make sure that they understood how the rubric system worked, as well as how they can apply their abilities in explaining. And with all of these steps combined, such components serve to create both a meaningful grading system and a meaningful learning experience for the students. To wrap up this presentation, we're going to do a quick check-in activity. For this check-in activity, we're going to take all of the things that we learned today, and we're going to practice using a rubric to provide feedback for peer work. So this is an example that was provided in the reading that we just discussed. And the original question that the student had to face is to select all of the figures that are similar to the red figure 8. Based on the example response and the rubric provided, how would you score this response? Pause the video and take a minute or two to grade the response by selecting a mastery level above from the rubric and thinking about some feedback you could provide based on the level you chose and the descriptions within the rubric.
Now, take a second to just notice and wonder, which mastery level did you select? How would you justify your choice? And also, in addition to that, what did you notice about the solution and what feedback would you ultimately give?
Now, how could this activity help students in the classroom with their own learning?
And then how would you compare this to a traditional point-based or letter-based grading, such as scoring from 0 to 100 or A to F?
Overall, we agree with the observations of the current state of grading and with where the future is heading within grading systems. When we did our observations, we also saw that UC High followed similar standards-based grading.
In addition, student agency in the grading process makes it feel less stressful and makes learning feel more fulfilling.
And grading through levels of mastery makes grades feel more like feedback rather than measures of worth or completion. And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
listening.